So the next key topic that we want to discuss for this class is the beginning of farming and the first villages. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that domestication and agriculture are not the same thing. In the last slideshow, we talked about our definition of domestication for this course and the processes that lead to domestication. But agriculture really means subsisting on or basing your subsistence on primarily domesticated foods. That's something that didn't happen until the Mesoamerican formative period. And in fact, it seems to have happened slightly after the establishment of the first villages, at least in some areas. So the key time period that we're talking about today is the early formative period. This dates roughly from about 2000 to 1000 before the Common Era, when we see the first hamlets and villages appear in Mesoamerica. This is what I focus my research on. I find really fascinating because it's a key moment of transformation between the Archaic period, egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups that we talked about in the last lecture, and the beginnings of social complexity, of permanent occupations, and of beginning to rely on agricultural economies in the Mesoamerican formative period. So you can see in this image a reconstruction of a Mesoamerican village, and you notice some key things that we didn't see for the Archaic period. Those include pottery. Look how some of those people are making ceramic vessels. They also include more experimentation with domesticated animals. Note the domesticated turkey walking through the site. There are some other key things here: animals that would have been imported for their pretty feathers or skins, houses that are more permanent structures than the campsites we saw for the Archaic period. So homes that are, in some places of Mesoamerica, people still live this way. Homes that are wattle and daub, or made of basically woven sticks for walls and then covered over with mud. That's the wattle and daub. And then they have grass or thatch roofs so that they can be protected from seasonal rainfall and so forth. These are homes made out of organic materials. They need to be substantially reconstructed about every 20 years, especially in the really wet kind of jungle areas. But we're beginning to see more permanent occupations during this period of Mesoamerica's history. So just to give you another kind of more detailed look at our chronology here, the Mesoamerican formative period is a pretty long period of a little over 2,000 years, from the beginning of the early formative period at about 2000 before the Common Era, or about 4,000 years ago, until 250 roughly of the Common Era, or less than 2,000 years ago. So it's a long time period. It's often broken up, depending on the region, into early, middle, and late, and some regions have a terminal formative period depending on the archaeology of the specific area. And this is a map that shows some of the key sites of the early formative period. Note that a lot of the key sites, unlike we saw for the investigation of the Archaic period, a lot of the key sites of the early formative are actually along the coasts. So you see some sites there in the Soconusco region that we'll be referring to a lot, of Chiapas and Guatemala. The Gulf coastal lowlands are going to be important for the Olmec a little bit later. And my research focuses on the Pacific coast of Oaxaca, and you can see the site of La Consentida there, located on the Pacific coast of Oaxaca near some famous modern surfing villages. So we will be discussing these sites quite a bit more. I will be returning to La Consentida a few times in this lecture. So some of the really important transitions that happened during the early formative period actually happened in different times in different parts of Mesoamerica. So for example, the Maya were using pottery a little bit later than were people in other parts of Mesoamerica, particularly in Mexico. So in some parts of Mexico, like where I work, for example, pottery goes back to 2000 before the Common Era, whereas in the Maya region, it's a little bit more recent, about 1200 rather, before the Common Era. There are some debates over the timing of sedentism, over the nature of agriculture versus horticulture. So for example, as we discussed earlier, agriculture tends to imply that you're reliant on domesticates, whereas horticulture means you can be sort of supplementing a diet of mostly wild resources with some domesticates. So the timing during which that transition happened in different parts of Mesoamerica appears to vary. There are also some big debates about social complexity, both how to define it, sort of what it is, and also when and how it occurred in different regions of Mesoamerica. For our purposes in this class, we'll mostly be talking about social complexity as something that includes status hierarchy. That's kind of a traditional definition of complexity, something that I've actually critiqued in my own work. But for the purposes of this class, it helps us to understand the concept. If you're born into a status, an elevated social status, rather than having to achieve it yourself, you probably live in a different kind of society, one we would call hierarchical, with ascribed hierarchical inequality. That type of social complexity appears to have happened first in the Soconusco region of Pacific coastal Chiapas and Guatemala, going back to about 1600 before the Common Era. And then we see it later for the Olmec region in the Gulf Coast that I just showed you on the map, and then even slightly later in central Mexico and in other parts of the highlands of Mesoamerica, such as in Oaxaca. So once again, the time period that we're talking about is really important as a transition from being nomadic hunter-gatherers with some horticulture to really starting to focus more on permanent settlements, permanent villages, focusing more on using domesticates, both plants and animals, becoming more agricultural over time. And different technologies came along with that. The more agricultural people got, the more they relied on pottery, for example. As I mentioned earlier, there are still parts of Mesoamerica today where people live in homes that appear to have been very similar to those of the early formative. So we see wattle and daub walls, or in some cases just the wattle walls with woven sticks, and then thatch roof, kind of grass roofs there. If we look at evidence from early formative period homes, this is a house floor that I excavated as part of my dissertation project. Not much is left of an ancient house after 4,000 years in the jungle, but what this was this stain of an earthen floor that's been excavated, and it turned out to be roughly square in shape, pretty small, 3 meters by 3 meters. And as we excavated around the edges of it, we actually found the post holes that probably held up the thatch roof of this early house. Other important features of early formative period villages include cooking hearths or cooking ovens, kind of like a fire pit where people might cook food. This photograph is from the site of La Consentida, where I've done my research in coastal Oaxaca. And in this cooking feature, we were able to find shell remains and actually some carbonized plant remains that left behind charcoal that we were able to radiocarbon date to demonstrate the antiquity of the site. The drawing above is actually from a different site, but it's just to show you what one of these cooking features or ovens or hearths, depending on what you call them, would look like from the side if it were kind of seen from the side. Other key features of early formative period sites include burials. In different parts of Mesoamerica, people have practiced different types of mortuary rituals. In some regions, people might be buried under the floors of their houses. In other regions, people might be buried in kind of early cemeteries. In this case, in coastal Oaxaca, it looks as though people were being buried away from the household, and this is actually, I've argued in some of my work that these are some of the earliest cemeteries we see in Mesoamerica. People are starting to be buried in kind of formalized ritual deposits away from the house. Another key feature that we look for in early formative period sites is middens. One of the best things for archaeologists to find is actually a pile of trash. Often we can get good evidence of what people were eating, remains of carbonized plants or animal bones, or as you can see in this image, lots of broken pottery, basically whatever they're tossing into the trash. This is another important feature of the early formative. Another thing we can see from early formative period sites is storage features. People would dig a bell-shaped pit. This might be dug initially to preserve some maize kernels for the next season or to store food in some way. But as over time, maybe that becomes more and more infested with vermin, or mice get into it or bugs get into it or something, that pit might be kind of recycled. They'll dig a new one where they can store their food in a more clean way, and they'll use the old pit to throw out some trash, or in some cases they actually use these for human burials. They'll actually recycle a pit to use it for human burials. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key distinguishing features of the early formative is that people start to use pottery. Pottery tends to be associated with more sedentary occupations, people living in one place. It tends to be associated with more agricultural peoples who are relying more on domesticates such as maize and beans and squash. And this is something that we use to identify the beginning of the early formative period. So here in this picture you can see some of those Tehuacan Valley pottery pieces that Scotty McNeish was discovering in the 70s. And then here from my own research in coastal Oaxaca, you can see some pottery from an early formative site that's really in some pretty diverse forms. So we've got everything from a really small suspended colored jar in the upper left that was found with a child burial, to greater bowls, some of which had little pour spouts that you can see in the upper right and lower right. Those were also found with child burials. A bottle that may have held some kind of liquid, maybe a beer or some kind of chocolate drink, found with an adult male burial. And then in the lower center you can see a large cooking jar that was found in a big midden of pottery. No burials there, but lots of pottery from cooking from some kind of feast. So these are handmade pots, made without using the wheel. They're often made of sort of a pinch coil technique. If you think back to high school pottery class, you may have made something like this yourself, although some of them are very beautifully done. And in parts of Mesoamerica today, people still make pottery in this way. So you can see these pictures from probably about the 1980s of a potter from Oaxaca making traditional handmade hand-coiled pottery. And if you look in the lower right, he's not using the wheel to spin that pot the way maybe a potter in the United States would, but look how nicely made those are. He's really an expert at making that pottery. So as I mentioned in a previous discussion, some of the first pottery in Mesoamerica from the Soconusco coast of Pacific, coastal Chiapas and Guatemala, is actually really well decorated. Notice, I know those are just little broken pieces, but notice how it's nicely smoothed. It's been maybe painted in some cases or given a colored slip. It's decorated with different kinds of incisions or impressions. Some of them, if you look in the upper center, are actually shaped like big gourds or even cacao pods or something like that. The argument is when this pottery was complete, as you can see in this painted reconstruction, it was really beautiful pottery. Probably not used for cooking. There's no evidence of having been cooked, but rather it was probably used to serve foods in some kind of feast, maybe cacao or maize beer, and other fancy foods for public events. And ceramics weren't just used to produce pottery. In the early formative, one of the things that people really began to do was depict themselves or depict human bodies or anthropomorphic bodies, things that look like humans, and depict animals or zoomorphic forms in pottery or in figurines or in musical instruments. So they're really using ceramic technology, this new technology they have beginning 4,000 years ago. They're really using it for some different purposes. The figurine you can see on the left is actually one of my favorite examples of an early formative figurine. It's from Highland, Oaxaca. This figurine was found and it appeared to be complete, and it had been sitting in a box in a research facility for years and years when a student came to do a project on it and found they were cleaning it with a toothbrush and cleaning off some dirt. They found that what looked like a complete figurine actually had a hollow area between the legs, and they kept cleaning, and it was just dirt. It wasn't fired clay. As they continued to clean, they discovered that this figurine depicted a woman with a hollow belly, and there was actually a tiny little figurine of a baby. Look between her feet inside. So this figurine actually allows you to sort of recreate human childbirth. And this was only discovered much later in the lab as the figurine was being cleaned. I love that example of how interactive and creative and sort of expressive these figurines can be. Now, if you look at the two photos to the right, those are figurines from my own research in coastal Oaxaca. The one on the lower photograph shows the body of a woman with a head they're often not that complete, they're often broken. And you can see she's wearing a big ear spool, so big gauged ears, big jewelry pressed through the ear, something that you might see today on your barista at Starbucks or something, a big gauge in the ear. That's an ancient Mesoamerican tradition. You can also see a band or hairstyle around her head there and a little bit of the other ear spool that broke off. But she was really had a beautifully decorated hair and jewelry. The figurine at the top is actually not a figurine, but it's the head of a bird from a musical instrument. I will show you some more evidence of these early instruments shortly. Other materials that we find from early formative period sites include chipped stone tools. So everything from, on the lower left, some kind of a bifacial scraper, to on the lower right, tools that appear to have been some kind of a drill tip, maybe for grinding or braiding or drilling holes. These are made from obsidian. You can see the really reflective black material and clear material. That's basically volcanic glass. And then some of the other kind of milkier, white-looking pieces are chert or chalcedony, much more resilient but less sharp material used for different kinds of tasks. Other evidence we have from early formative period contexts include remains of ancient plants. Even if the plant themselves aren't preserved, we might be able to find starch grains or phytoliths, tiny silica deposits from plant cell walls, or even pollen. If you follow the link that I've posted in the module for this week, you can see an article that was written about remains of ancient food from La Consentida, recovered from some of these ceramic vessels. And you can see in the lower left a grad student from Canada that I worked with who helped identify some of the plants from La Consentida. Other evidence we might find from early formative period Mesoamerican sites may tell us a little bit more about ideology and what people thought of the universe. This ritual deposit was recovered at La Consentida and includes a really interesting combination of different materials. There's the complete skeleton of a venomous reptile called Heloderma horridum. It's a close relative of a Gila monster and actually capable of injecting venom through its fangs. At its nose was found an 8 million year old fossilized shark tooth. Look how sharp that is. Just a really small shark tooth, but it must have been collected by some ancient ritual practitioner and may have been used to let blood because it's so sharp. We'll talk about auto-sacrifice and bloodletting a little bit later in class. And then my personal favorite example is a musical instrument that was found at the tail of the reptile that if you go to my Sketchfab models that I posted in this week's learning module, you can actually hear what this instrument sounds like. It's one of the oldest ceramic musical instruments in Mesoamerica. So something I was able to do with a group of colleagues was work on these preserved musical instruments. Some of them don't play because they're just the head. Some of them do play, but they're missing the head. But basically these instruments all seem to represent, or mostly seem to represent, birds. When you play them, they sound like a bird. And I argue that in terms of Mesoamerican belief, to play them is sort of to become a bird, which means to be able to communicate with the ancestors. So again, if you follow that link, which I posted in the module, you can see and hear some of the models of the figurines and musical instruments from La Consentida. But as I leave you for this slideshow, I'll actually play a recording of this sort of best preserved and best playing musical instrument from nearly 4,000 years ago.